The smoke reached the Duke of Ashcombe before the house did, and it was the wrong smoke, not the sweet gray of a kitchen fire nor the resinous curl of burning brushwood, but a thick, papery, acrid smoke with black flakes riding on it, and Gabriel Thorne, ninth Duke of Ashcombe, who had spent the better part of his solitary life among books and knew the smell of them living, knew at once and with a cold turn of the stomach the smell of them dying. He put his heels to the grey and came round the last bend of the lane at a canter, and there, before the ivied front of Wanborough Grange, was a bonfire, and the bonfire was made of books. They had been heaped on the gravel of the sweep and set alight, a great tumbled pyre of them, calf and vellum and marbled board, the fine gilt titles blistering and curling as the flames took them folios and quartos, a whole scholar's life of them, going up in the raw March morning while two manservants stood by with rakes, and a stout woman in black bombazine directed the burning from the steps with the composure of a general. And on her knees in the gravel at the very edge of the fire, heedless of the heat of her scorched hands, of the ruin of her grey gown, a young woman was dragging singed volumes from the blaze with her bare fingers and clutching them to her breast, and weeping, not loudly, not in the abandoned way of a child, but in a terrible silent shaking that was worse than any wailing, the weeping of someone being torn apart and forbidden to cry out. Gabriel was off his horse before he had decided to dismount. "Stop this," he said. He did not raise his voice. He had never in his life needed to raise his voice. The voice of 9 generations of Ashcombe carried its own weight. The manservants froze with their rakes lifted. The stout woman on the steps turned, and her face handsome once, gone hard and pouched with a lifetime of small resentments arranged itself in an instant from command into a bright social welcome that Gabriel found more chilling than the fire. "Your Grace," she cried, sweeping down the steps in a rustle of bombazine. "What an honor! We had no notion had we known your Grace intended to call we should never have it is only a little clearing out. You understand. An old man's mouldering rubbish, quite worthless, dreadfully damp. A positive nest of silverfish. My late brother-in-law was a great scribbler and hoarder, and the whole west room has been given over to his leavings these 2 years, and I have determined at last to have it cleared and papered and put to some Christian use. I am Mrs. Honoria Marsh. I have the keeping of the Grange now, and of my poor dead sister's girl, and I assure your Grace we are not in the habit of—" "Those are not worthless," Gabriel said. He had crossed to the fire while she talked. He stooped and drew from the edge of it, where the flames had not yet reached, a heavy quarto bound in worn Russia leather, and turned it in his scorched hot hands and read the spine, and something moved in him that he had not felt in a long time. "This," he said, "is the Aldine Ovid, the one printed in Venice by Aldus Manutius 300 years ago, in the italic letter he himself commissioned. There are perhaps 40 copies in England. I have hunted one for 11 years. You are burning it to paper your parlour." He looked up, and the mildness had gone out of his grey eyes entirely. "Madam, do you know what you have done?" Mrs. Marsh's smile did not falter, but something behind it recalculated with the speed of a woman who has just learned that the rubbish she despised is coveted by a duke. "Why, if there is anything of value, naturally your Grace is most welcome to anything he cares to. They are not yours to give." The words fell into a sudden silence. It was not Gabriel who had spoken. It was the young woman on her knees in the gravel, and she had lifted her face. A fine face, Gabriel saw, or would have been fine were it not swollen and streaked and desperate, a face of about 22 with dark level brows and grey eyes very like his own, and she was not looking at him at all. She was looking at her aunt. "They are not yours to give, and they were not yours to burn," she said, and her voice, though it shook, did not break. "They were my father's, and now they are mine. He left them to me. He left me nothing else in all the world, and he left me those, every one by name in his will, and you have burned them, aunt. You have stood on the steps and directed the burning of my father, for that is what they were the whole of what was left of him, his hand in the margins and his notes and the pages he turned." She stopped, because she could not go on, and bent again over the singed books in her lap, and the silent shaking took her once more. Mrs. Marsh's voice went cold and flat, and in it Gabriel heard, stripped of its company manners, the true habitual sound of the house. "Get up, Rosamond. You are making a spectacle of yourself before his grace, groveling in the gravel like a scullery maid. The books are damp rubbish and the west room is wanted, and there is an end of it. Your father left you a garret full of mildew and a great deal of pride, and neither will get you a husband, and I have kept you 2 years out of Christian duty and asked nothing but a little gratitude and a little sense, and I have had neither. Get up and go to your room." The girl did not get up. She knelt in the gravel with her father's burned books in her arms and looked at the fire, and Gabriel, standing between the two women in the acrid smoke of the March morning, understood three things in quick succession, and each of them changed the course of his life, though he did not yet know it. He understood, first, that he was looking at a cruelty of the small domestic kind that the world never punishes, a cruelty perfectly legal, perfectly respectable, dressed in Christian duty and the language of good sense, and all the more absolute for being unpunishable. He understood, second, that the girl kneeling in the gravel had a courage in her that he had met in very few people in a life spent among the powerful, the courage to say they are not yours to give to a woman who held her whole existence in her hands, knowing it would cost her, saying it anyway, because some things are true and must be said whatever they cost. And he understood, third and last and most disturbing of all, that he could not bear it. Gabriel Thorne had spent 11 years since his father's death perfecting the art of not being able to bear things by the simple expedient of not caring about them. He had retreated into his great library at Ashcombe, and his correspondence with scholars in Leipzig and Bologna, and his cold, ordered, bookish solitude, and he had told himself it was contentment, and had nearly believed it. And now a fire in a stranger's gravel sweep had reached into that ordered solitude and taken hold of something he had thought long since banked to ash, and he stood in the smoke and felt it burn. "How many are left?" he said. He said it quietly to the girl, not the aunt. She looked up at him, uncomprehending. "Your Grace." "The library, your father's library, how much of it is here?" He gestured at the diminishing pyre. "This is not a scholar's whole collection. A man who owned the Aldine Ovid owned 1,000 volumes, 2,000. This is a fraction. Where is the rest?" Mrs. Marsh answered before the girl could. "Sold," she said with satisfaction. "The bulk of it months since to a bookseller in Ashwick Pettifer, the fellow in the Market Square. He gave me £40 for the lot and glad to have the room. These," she nodded at the fire, "are only what he would not take. The odd volumes, the damaged, the sermons and such, worthless, as I said. Though it seems," and here her eyes went to the Aldine Ovid still in Gabriel's hands, and narrowed, "I am to be told I have been cheated, and by my own dead brother-in-law's leavings. If there is money in them, your Grace, I am sure I never knew it, and I am a poor widow with a daughter to establish, and if his Grace has taken a fancy to that particular book, I should be very happy to." "I will give you £30 for it," Gabriel said, "and for every other volume you have not yet burned, sight unseen, this moment, on condition the fire is put out now before another page is lost. £30. Do we agree?" £30 for a heap of singed books she had been about to turn to ash was a sum that transfigured Mrs. Honoria Marsh's whole face. "Agreed," she said, almost before he had finished, and turned to the servants and cried, "Put it out. Put it out, you fools. Don't stand there, water, quickly," and the raking that had fed the fire became a frantic smothering of it, and within minutes the pyre was a black steaming ruin, but a ruin from which perhaps 24 volumes were saved that would otherwise have burned. And through the whole of it Rosamond Clare knelt in the gravel with her father's books in her arms, and looked up at the Duke of Ashcombe with an expression he could not read and would puzzle over for weeks, not gratitude, or not only gratitude, but something warier and more wondering, the look of a person who has stopped, long ago, expecting rescue, and does not quite know what to do with the fact of it when it comes. He did not know her yet. He knew only her name, Rosamond, and that her father had owned the Aldine Ovid and marked his books in his own hand, and loved his daughter enough to leave her the one treasure he possessed, and that a hard woman in black bombazine had burned that treasure on a March morning to paper a parlor, and that he, Gabriel Thorne, 9th Duke of Ashcombe, who had not cared about anything living for 11 years, found that he cared about this, cared with a sudden fierce protectiveness that frightened him with its strength, and did not mean to let the matter rest with 30 pounds and a smothered fire. He rode home to Ashcombe that afternoon with 24 singed volumes wrapped in his own coat and lashed behind his saddle, and the Aldine Ovid inside his breast against his heart, and a single hard resolution forming in him with the slow certainty of a thing decided at the deepest level of the self, below argument, below sense. That the library of the late Reverend Clare would be made whole again, every volume of it hunted down and bought back, whatever it cost and however long it took, and restored to the girl who had knelt in the gravel to save what she could of her father with her bare and burning hands. He did not go straight in when he reached Ashcombe that afternoon. He carried the singed books himself, in his own arms, up the great stair and along the gallery to his library, waving off the footmen who came to relieve him of the burden, for it seemed to him a thing he must do with his own hands. And he laid them out on the long table beneath the tall windows where the westering light came in, and he cleaned them, one by one, through the whole of that afternoon and into the candlelight, with a soft brush and a chamois and his own care, brushing away the char and the water stain, easing open the scorched boards, coaxing the swollen leaves apart. There were 23 of them saved from the fire, and as he worked over them, Gabriel came to know the man who had owned them, in the way one comes to know the dead through the books they loved. The Reverend Josiah Clare had been a scholar of the old, unworldly, entirely happy kind of country parson who had spent a small living and a long life on Greek and Latin, and the study of things no one paid him to study, and who had written in his books, in a small, cramped, affectionate hand, the whole of a mind at play, arguments with the authors, jokes, cross-references, lines of his own composing, and here and there notes that were not scholarship at all. Rosa's birthday, she is 7 today, and construed her first sentence of Ovid, wept over the metamorphosis of the girl into the reed, said it was cruel, I could not answer her. That in a battered metamorphoses in the margin of the very passage, and in a small Greek testament on the end paper in the same hand but shakier later, if I have taught her nothing else, I have taught her to love what is true and to say it though the heavens fall. She will suffer for it. So did I. It is the only inheritance worth the leaving. Gabriel sat with that inscription a long time in the candlelight. He understood, reading it, exactly what he had seen kneel in the gravel the girl who said they are not yours to give to a woman who held her whole existence in her hand, saying it though the heavens fell, because her father had taught her to love what was true and say it. And he understood, too, with a pang that surprised him by its sharpness, the poverty of his own inheritance beside the old parson's. For Gabriel Thorne had been left a dukedom, 10,000 acres, 10,000 books, and a name 8 centuries old. And he had been left by the same father no single line such as that, no if I have taught her nothing else, nothing that was love rather than duty. The 9th Duke of Ashcombe had inherited everything and been given nothing, and a penniless orphan in a burned garret had inherited nothing and been given everything, and Gabriel sat among his 23 saved books and envied a dead pauper his daughter's grief. His own retreat from the world had begun 11 years before, on the day the 8th Duke died. It had not been grief. Exactly, his father had been a cold, correct, forbidding man, and there had been little between them to grieve, but a kind of exhaustion, a giving up. Gabriel had spent his youth trying and failing to earn a warmth his father did not possess to give, and when the old man died, and the whole weight of Ashcombe came down on his son's shoulders, Gabriel had discovered that he no longer had the heart for the world of drawing-rooms and marriage markets and ambitious mothers, and had withdrawn into his library and his correspondence with distant scholars, and had let the county call him a recluse, and had told himself he was content. There had been a young woman once, early a suitable match his father had half arranged, but she had found him cold and married elsewhere, and Gabriel had not greatly minded, which had told him something about himself he had not liked to examine, and so had stopped examining, and had shut the door on that too. 11 years he had lived so, among his books, a man who had decided that not to feel was the same as to be at peace. And now a fire in a stranger's gravel sweep had shown him the difference. He sat in his library that first night with the Reverend Clare's saved books around him and his own long cold contentment in ruins, and he understood that he had not been at peace at all. He had been asleep or dead or waiting, he could not tell which, and that a girl he had exchanged 4 sentences with had woken him, and that the waking hurt as a frozen limb hurts when the blood comes back, and that he would not for anything in the world go back to sleep. His housekeeper, Mrs. Bassett, a woman who had known him from a boy, found him still there at midnight in his shirt-sleeves, bent over a scorched book by a guttering candle, and stood in the doorway a long moment before she spoke. "Your Grace has had no dinner," she said at last, "and there's char all down your good coat, and you've the look of a man that's seen a ghost. Whatever's happened?" "Nothing has happened, Mrs. Bassett," said Gabriel, which was the truth and the largest lie he had ever told. "Only I have found some books I did not expect to find. Have a room made ready, the long south room, the empty one and shelves ordered for it. I am about to acquire a library." "Your Grace has a library, 10,000 books, the last time the London man counted them." "I am about to acquire another," said Gabriel, "a better one. Good night, Mrs. Bassett." And he bent again to the scorched metamorphoses, to the margin where a dead man had written that his 7-year-old daughter had wept over a girl turned into a reed and called it cruel. And Mrs. Bassett went away down the dark gallery shaking her head, and told the cook in the morning that his Grace had gone strange, and that she couldn't say whether it was for the better or the worse, only that it was the most alive she'd seen him look in 11 years, char and all. There was one other person Gabriel thought of, that first night, whom he would have to reckon with sooner or later. His father's sister, Lady Cordelia Thorne, the dowager who kept a small, elegant house at the edge of the Ashcombe Park, and who was, since his father's death, the nearest thing to family Gabriel possessed. Lady Cordelia was 75, sharp as a lancet, entirely without illusions, and the only living soul who spoke to the Duke of Ashcombe as though he were a nephew rather than a demigod. She had watched his 11-year retreat with a disapproval she made no attempt to hide, and had told him more than once that a man who chose books over people had confused the shadow with the substance. And Gabriel knew, laying his own plans that first night, that Lady Cordelia would see through him in an instant, and that he would have to decide before long whether to confide in her or contrive to keep from the one person in the world clever enough and fond enough to help him. He decided nothing that night. But he thought of her, and it was the first time in a long while that Gabriel Thorne had thought of another living person as someone he might need rather than someone he must merely endure, and he noticed the difference, and knew whom to thank for it, and had not the least idea yet how much more there was to come. The bookshop of Mr. Josiah Pettifer stood in the crooked market square of Ashwick between a chandler's and a saddler's, its bow window crammed with calf and vellum, its low dark interior smelling of dust and leather, and the particular Swedish decay of old paper that was, to Gabriel, the smell of home. He had been a customer of Pettifer's for 20 years. He came the very next morning, before the shutters were fairly down, and found the bookseller, a small, round, stooped man with spectacles pushed up into a fringe of white hair perched on his ladder among the higher shelves. "Your Grace, you're abroad early. I've the Strabo you asked after come at last from the sale at the Reverend Clare's library," Gabriel said. "You bought it, some months since. £40 from a Mrs. Marsh of Wanborough Grange. Where is it?" Pettifer's face changed. He came down the ladder slowly, and when he reached the bottom he took off his spectacles and polished them on his apron, which Gabriel had learned over 20 years was the thing Pettifer did when he was troubled. "Ah," said the bookseller, "that library, yes." He put the spectacles back on. "I'll tell your Grace the truth of it, for it's sat ill with me since. I gave that woman £40 for 1100 volumes, and I knew when I did it that it was robbery, and I did it anyway, God forgive me, because she'd have sold them to the trunk maker for waste paper else, to line boxes and wrap butter, and I could not bear it. Reverend Clare was a customer of mine 30 years, a true scholar, a gentle soul. He'd come in of a market day and we'd talk the morning away over a single book, and he'd buy it if he could afford it and grieve over it a week if he couldn't. When I heard he'd died and left everything to his girl, and the sister-in-law had the disposing of it, he shook his head. I saved what I could. That's all I can say for myself. I saved the books from the butter. But I paid a widow £40 for a fortune, because £40 was what she'd have taken from the trunk maker, and I hadn't the means to pay their worth. And I've a shop to keep, your grace, and I'm not a rich man. How many have you sold on? Some, 150. The finest went first collectors, the London trade, a lot to a gentleman in Bath. The Aldine Ovid I'd have sold in a week, but the woman kept it back, said she'd a fancy to it, and he stopped. But your grace knows about the Ovid, I think. Word came this morning there'd been a fire at the Grange. I have the Ovid, Gabriel said. I bought it out of the fire with as much of the rest as had not burned. He set his hand flat on the counter. Pettifer, I want the library, the whole of it. Every volume you still hold, and the record of every volume you have sold, and to whom, so that I may go and buy them back. I will pay you their full worth for what you have, not £40, their worth, whatever your books value them at, and a fair commission on the labor of it. And I will pay whatever it costs to recover the rest from Bath and London and wherever else they have flown. I want the Reverend Clare's library made whole, every volume, and I want it done quietly, and I want it done properly, and you are the only man in England who can help me do it. Pettifer looked at him a long moment over the tops of his spectacles. He was a shrewd old man, and he had known the Duke of Ashcombe 20 years, and he had never once in those 20 years heard him speak with the low banked heat that was in his voice now. That, said the bookseller slowly, will be a very great labor, and a very great deal of money, your grace, for a library that is worth, all told, perhaps £400 to the trade. A man does not spend £400 and the labor of a year to reassemble a country parson's library that he might buy the like of new for half the sum, unless— he polished his spectacles again— unless it is not the library he is buying. Gabriel said nothing. The girl, said Pettifer softly, Miss Clare, you've seen her. I have seen a young woman kneel in the gravel and burn her hands pulling her dead father out of a fire, Gabriel said, while a woman in bombazine called it Christian duty. That is what I have seen. Will you help me or not? I'll help you, said Pettifer. I'd have helped you for nothing, for the Reverend's sake and the girl's, but I'll take your money, your grace, and thank you for it, for the labor will be real and my shop will suffer for the time I give it. And I'll say one thing more, and then I'll hold my tongue and do as I'm bid. If you mean to give those books back to that girl, and I can think of no other reason on earth a man would do this thing, then think how you do it. You cannot drive up to Wanborough Grange in the ducal carriage and hand a poor relation 1,100 volumes. The aunt would sell them again inside a fortnight and pocket the money, or burn them from spite, and the girl would be worse off than before, for she'd have been given hope and had it taken. And you cannot court the girl openly, a duke and a penniless dependent, without ruining her in the doing of it, for the county would say she'd angled for you, and the aunt would say it loudest of all. Whatever you do, your grace, you must do it so it cannot be taken from her and cannot be turned against her, which is a harder thing than merely spending money. Money is the easy part. It is always the easy part. Gabriel walked back to where his horse was tied in the market square and stood a long while with his hand on the animal's neck, thinking, while the market went on around him, the country folk with their baskets, the cheesewife and the ballad seller and the boys running between the stalls, all the ordinary living world he had held at arm's length for 11 years. Pettifer was right, and the rightness of it was a wall. He could not give her the books. He could not court her. He could not, being who he was, do a single one of the plain, direct things that a plain, direct man might do. His rank, which had always seemed to him a kind of armor, showed itself now as a kind of cage, and the girl in the gravel was on the outside of it, and he did not know how to reach her without doing her harm. And then, standing in the market square with his hand on his horse's warm neck, Gabriel Thorne thought of a way. He could not give her the books, but he could return them to her. Not all at once, not as a gift from a duke, not in any manner that could be seized or sold or twisted, but one at a time, quietly, anonymously, each single volume finding its way back to her by some means that left no name attached and no debt owing and nothing the aunt could touch. A book is a small thing. A book might be slipped to a girl by 100 small chances. And if it came with no name, if it came only as itself, her father's book, returned as though the world had somehow relented, then it could not be taken from her, for there would be no giver to accuse, no favor to repay, no scandal to make. She would simply have one morning a book she had lost, and then another, each one a small, impossible mercy, arriving out of nowhere, asking nothing. It was, he understood even as he conceived it, a strange and roundabout and possibly foolish way to go about the plainest thing in the world, which was to be kind to someone. And it would take him months, perhaps years, and she would never know it was he, which meant he would never have from her the thanks or the warmth or the softening look that a plainer man would have earned at once with a plainer gift. He would do the whole of it in the dark and reap none of it and want none of it, or want it rather and forego it, which is a different and harder thing. But it was the one way that could not hurt her, and so it was the way he would take. He began that week. Pettifer had among his stock some 60 of the Reverend Clare's volumes yet unsold, and Gabriel bought them all, and had the bookseller identify, from the flyleaf inscriptions and the marginal hand, those that had most plainly been the old man's especial companions, the ones most read, most annotated, most worn at the corners by a loving thumb. And the first of these, a small 12mo Horace in a shabby green binding, its margins thick with the Reverend's penciled arguments and its end papers covered in a cramped affectionate scholar's hand, Gabriel arranged to be the first to find its way home. The means cost him some thought. In the end it was Pettifer who solved it. The bookseller had a niece in service at Wanborough Grange, a kitchen girl named Suki, honest and fond of Miss Rosamond, who was the only soul in that cold house to show the poor relation a kindness. Through Suki, for the price of a shilling and a strict charge of secrecy, the little green Horace was conveyed up to the Grange and left, one gray April morning, on the sill of the west-facing window seat where Suki reported Miss Rosamond still sat every day in the empty, half-cleared, smoke-stained room that had been her father's library, among the marks on the floor where the shelves had stood, doing her mending in the one place in the house that had ever been hers. Gabriel was not there to see her find it. He would not be there to see her find any of them. That was the whole nature of the thing. But Suki, reporting back through her uncle, told what she had seen through the door, and Pettifer, with a delicacy that did him credit, passed it on to the Duke exactly, and Gabriel kept the words and took them out often in the weeks that followed in the great silent library of Ashcombe, alone. The girl had come into the empty room with her mending, Suki said, and sat down in the window seat where she always sat, and then gone very still, because there on the sill beside her was a book. She had picked it up as though it might vanish. She had opened it and seen her father's hand in the margins, and she had made a sound Suki could not describe the sound, only that it was not weeping or not merely weeping, and she had pressed the little book to her face, to her mouth, and sat so a long time, rocking with the book pressed to her, in the empty ruined room where the shelves had been. And then she had looked all round her, wildly, and gone to the window and looked out, up and down the empty lane, searching for whoever had done it. And there had been no one. And she had come back to the window seat and sat down and held the book in her two hands and looked at it, and looked, as though it were the whole world come back to her, one small green shabby volume of it, arrived from nowhere on an ordinary gray morning, asking nothing. Gabriel Thorne sat in his own great library that evening with the fire low and the candles unlit, and did not read, though he was surrounded by 10,000 books, and he thought that he had given away one small book he would never see again to a girl who would never know his name, and that he had received in exchange, second-hand, through a kitchen girl and a bookseller, the account of a face pressed to a green binding in an empty room. And he found, turning it over in the dark, that it was the richest bargain of his life, and that he wanted, more than he had wanted anything in 11 years to make it again. And again, and again until every book was home and the empty room was full and the girl who had stopped expecting rescue had 1,000 small proofs, arriving one by one out of the silence, that the world had not, after all, forgotten her. The recovery of the library became, that spring, the secret center of Gabriel's life, and he pursued it with an energy that astonished the few who witnessed any part of it. Pettifer's records were the map, the Duke's money and men were the means, and one by one the scattered volumes of the Reverend Clare's collection were run to earth and brought home. Some came easily, some did not. The finest of the classics had gone to a collector in Bath, a Mr. Adderley, who understood their worth exactly and had no reason on earth to part with them. And Gabriel had to send Enderby down in person, and pay a price that made even the bookseller wince, and endure a fortnight's suspense, before the 40 volumes came north in a nailed crate and were carried up to the long south room at Ashcombe to wait their turn to go home. A run of the fathers had gone to a Cambridge college and could not be got back at any price, the college being forbidden by its statutes to sell. And Gabriel, defeated there, did the only thing left to him, which was to hunt down other copies of the same editions, matched as near as could be, so that Rosamond should have the texts if she could not have the very volumes, though he grieved over the substitution, knowing it was her father's own hand in the margins she truly wanted, and that no other copy could carry that. It was slow, painstaking, expensive, thankless work, and Gabriel had never been happier in his life. He rose early. He ate with appetite. He rode into Ashwick 2 and 3 times a week to confer with Pettifer over the ledgers, and the two men, the Duke and the bookseller, bent together over the long lists in the dusty back room of the shop like two conspirators, ticking off the recovered and plotting the pursuit of the lost. And Pettifer said once, wiping his spectacles, that in 40 years of the trade he had never known a customer take such joy in books he did not mean to keep. And Gabriel had answered that they were the only books he had ever owned that were worth more given away than kept, and Pettifer had looked at him a moment and said nothing, and ticked another volume off the list. And through it all came Suki's reports, the small precious dispatches from the front, relayed up through Pettifer. How Miss Rosamond had found the Cicero tucked in the wood basket and stood stock still with it a full minute. How she had found the little Theocritus among the churchyard ivy and laughed aloud, alone, a thing Suki had not heard her do in the whole 2 years. How she had taken to leaving the west window unlatched at the Grange, and checking it first thing each morning, and how her whole day was made or dimmed by whether a book had come. Gabriel kept every one of these. He did not deceive himself about what they were to him. A plainer, better man would have gone to the girl, and courted her honestly, and earned her thanks to his face. He could not, and so he lived on these second-hand crumbs of her joy, and found them sweeter than any feast his rank had ever set before him, and understood that he had fallen in love not with a face across a parlor, but with a mind he had never properly spoken to, and a courage he had witnessed once in the gravel, and that this was either the truest way to fall in love or the most foolish, and that he no longer cared which. His aunt found him out, of course. Lady Cordelia Thorne came up to the great house one April afternoon, unannounced, as was her privilege, and found her nephew in the long south room directing the hanging of new oak shelves, in his shirt-sleeves, cheerful, dusty, and evasive. And she sat herself down on the one chair the room contained and watched him for a while through her lorgnette, and then said, "You are in love. Do not trouble to deny it, Gabriel. I have not lived 75 years to be lied to by a nephew who never could dissemble. You have not looked like this since you were a boy of 9 and I gave you the pony. Who is she, and why are you building shelves instead of proposing?" Gabriel caught, considered lying, and found he did not wish to, quite, and considered telling the whole truth, and found he could not, quite. For the whole truth involved a forged annuity not yet arranged, and a secret that Rosamond herself did not yet know, and he would not risk it, even with Cordelia, until it was done. So he told her part. He told her of the fire, and the burned books, and the girl in the gravel, and the library he was quietly reassembling. And he did not tell her of the annuity he was even then plotting, nor how far his feeling had already carried him. only that there was a young gentlewoman, poor and dependent and wronged, whom he admired, and whom he could not court without ruining, and whom he was helping in the only ways that would not harm her. Lady Cordelia heard him out, her sharp old eyes never leaving his face, and when he had done she was silent a while, and then she said a thing he did not expect. "Your father," she said, "would have called you a fool. He would have said a duke does not spend a fortune and a season on a parson's orphan, that you are demeaning your name, that you should marry a woman of your own rank and get an heir and put the girl out of your mind. My brother said such things to me once, about a man I loved 45 years ago, and I was weak enough to listen to him, and I have regretted it every day of my life since, and I have never told a living soul until this moment." She rose and came to him and put her small dry hand on his arm. "So I will not say what your father would have said. I will say this instead. You have spent 11 years dead, Gabriel, and it grieved me past bearing, for I loved you and could not reach you. And you are not dead now. I do not know this girl, but I know what has come back into your face, and I know what it cost me to let mine go, and I tell you, whatever it costs, whatever the county says, whatever your name suffers, do not let this one be talked out of your hands, not by your father's ghost and not by your own pride, which is your father's ghost wearing your coat. Get her, Gabriel. Get her honestly and get her openly the moment you can do it without harm, and let me live to see you happy before I die, for it is the one thing left in the world I want." And she pressed his arm and went out, small and straight, leaving her nephew standing among the new-hung shelves with a tightness in his throat he had not felt in years. And Gabriel understood that he had, without quite intending it, gained an ally, and that the getting of Rosamond Clare, when the time came, would not have to be done entirely alone. The books came home that spring the way the swallows came, one and then another, and then, as Gabriel and Pettifer perfected their quiet machinery, in a steady trickle that Sukey wove into the ordinary traffic of the house so cunningly that Mrs. Marsh never once suspected. A volume left on the window seat, a volume slipped among the linen Rosamond was set to mend, a volume found in the woodshed where she went for kindling, or on the churchyard wall by her mother's grave where she walked on a Sunday, or once tucked into the manger of the old pony she was fond of. Each one a book her father had owned and marked and loved, each one arriving from nowhere with no name, asking nothing. Gabriel bought them back from wherever they had flown. Pettifer's records led him to the gentleman in Bath, who parted with his 40 volumes readily enough at a handsome profit, to a clergyman in the next county who had bought a box of divinity and gave it up, when the Duke's man explained the case, for the mere cost of the carriage and a blessing on the enterprise, to a London dealer who drove a hard bargain over a run of the classics and got it, for Gabriel had ceased entirely to care what the recovery cost. Twice the trail went cold, and he set inquiry men to work as another man might set them to recover stolen plate. He was recovering stolen plate. That was precisely how he had come to think of it, that a theft had been committed, a theft the law would never name, and that he had appointed himself, for reasons he did not examine too closely, the one man in England determined to undo it. He might have kept the whole enterprise at arm's length, a matter of letters and agents and Pettifer's good offices, and never once set eyes on Rosamond Clare again. He did not. He found to his own discomfort that he could not stay away. He began to call at Wanborough Grange. He had a pretext of a kind. The neighborhood, learning that the reclusive Duke of Ashcombe had for once emerged from his library and taken to paying calls, buzzed like a struck hive, and Mrs. Honoria Marsh, who had spent 2 years and the last of her dead husband's money trying to force her way into a society that found her vulgar, could not believe her fortune when the Duke's card was brought in on a silver tray she had bought expressly against such a miracle. That he should call at the Grange, that a duke should honor her threshold, was a triumph beyond her wildest scheming, and she never for one instant supposed the honor had anything to do with the shabby dependent niece she kept upstairs at her mending. She supposed it had everything to do with her daughter. For Mrs. Marsh had a daughter, and the daughter was the whole engine of her life. Adelaide Marsh was 19, pretty in the bold, high-colored way that fades early, accomplished in the manner of a young woman who has been drilled rather than taught. She played 3 pieces on the pianoforte very loudly and a 4th badly, painted screens, and could recite the peerage like a catechism. And she had been raised from the cradle to the single conviction that she was destined for greatness, and that the world's only office was to provide it. Her mother had brought her to Wanborough with the sole object of marrying her high, and the arrival of an unmarried duke not 5 miles off had been the reason Mrs. Marsh took the Grange at all. That the Duke had now begun to call could mean, to a mind like Mrs. Marsh's, only one thing, and she flung Adelaide at him with a violence of hospitality that would have been comic, had it not been, to Gabriel, so grimly instructive. He bore it. He bore the loud pianoforte and the painted screens and the recited peerage. He bore Mrs. Marsh's transparent maneuvers, the sudden convenient errands that left him alone with Adelaide, the arch remarks about how a great house wanted a mistress, the meaning looks. He bore it all with the flat, courteous impassivity that his rank made easy, and he bore it for one reason only, that if he came often enough and sat long enough, and let the aunt believe what she wished to believe, then sometimes, not always, for they kept her hard at work, sometimes Rosamond would be in the room. She was never brought in as Adelaide was brought in. She was brought in as furniture is brought in to pour the tea, to fetch a shawl, to turn her cousin's music, to be in the smooth, cruel economy of that house, the plain foil that made the pretty daughter prettier. She wore made-over gowns 2 seasons old. She was addressed when she was addressed at all, in the tone one uses to a servant one is not quite paying. And she bore it as Gabriel bore his own ordeal, with a still straight-backed dignity that gave nothing away. But he had seen her face pressed to a green Horace in an empty room, second-hand in his mind's eye, 100 times, and he watched her now across Mrs. Marsh's crowded parlour, and thought that the world had arranged itself with particular malice, to seat him 5 feet from the one person he had crossed the county to be near, and forbid him to say a single true word to her. For he could not court her. Pettifer's warning held. It held harder the more he saw of the house. To show, by so much as a glance, that it was Rosamond and not Adelaide he came for, would be to sign the girl's ruin. Her aunt would turn on her the instant she was seen as a rival to Adelaide's ambitions, and the county, which already pitied and half despised the poor dependent, would say she had schemed to catch the Duke over her own cousin's head. He had seen already what Mrs. Marsh did to those who crossed her ambitions. He would not put Rosamond in that fire, having just pulled her out of another. And so Gabriel did a thing he had never done in his life. He dissembled. He let Mrs. Marsh believe he came for Adelaide. He was scrupulously, blandly attentive to the daughter and scrupulously, blandly indifferent to the niece, and he hated every hour of it, and he learned in those hours more than he had ever wished to know about the particular cost of being poor and dependent and female in a world that assigned such persons no value and gave them no defense. Only twice in all those spring weeks did he manage to exchange with Rosamond Clare any word that was truly her own. The first was over a book. Adelaide had been made to display her accomplishments, and among them her mother numbered a taste for literature which Adelaide did not possess, and Mrs. Marsh, gesturing at a handsome unread set of volumes bought by the yard to furnish the parlour, invited his Grace to admire her daughter's library. And Gabriel, glancing at the spines, remarked mildly that he saw she had the new translation of Dante, and asked Miss Marsh which of the 3 cantates she preferred. Adelaide, who did not know that the Divine Comedy had 3 parts or indeed that it had any, colored and floundered, and said she thought them all very fine, and into the small awful silence that followed, Rosamond, pouring the tea, said quietly without looking up, "The Paradiso, surely. It is the hardest and the least read, but my father used to say a person who loved only the Inferno loved only the punishment, and that it took a finer soul to care for the mercy." Mrs. Marsh's head came round sharply, but Gabriel had already turned to Rosamond. It was the first time he had permitted himself to address her directly in all those weeks, and he said, quietly, "Your father was right. It is the commonest error there is, to mistake the vividness of punishment for the truth of a thing. The mercy is harder to write and harder to read because it is harder to believe, but it is the truer country." And he held her eyes one instant too long, one instant, no more, but enough that he saw in them a flare of startled recognition, the look of a person who has, without warning, been spoken to as an equal after long being spoken to as a chair. And then Mrs. Marsh was between them, exclaiming that Rosamond forgot herself and had let the tea grow cold, and the moment was gone. The second was in the garden. He had been shown, at Mrs. Marsh's insistence, the improvements she was making to the shrubbery, Adelaide on his arm, and coming round a yew hedge they had surprised Rosamond at the far end of the walk, sitting on a stone bench in the 1 hour of freedom the day allowed her, with a book open in her lap. She had risen at once to withdraw as she had been trained to withdraw, but Gabriel had seen before she closed it the shabby green of the binding and known it for the little Horace, the first of all the books he had sent home, and his heart had turned over. And as the party passed, Mrs. Marsh sweeping ahead to point out a new sundial, he had fallen a half-step behind and said to Rosamond, very low so that only she could hear, "You have found your Horace, I see." She had gone white and then red, and looked at him with a sudden desperate searching intensity. "How does your Grace know it is mine?" He had not thought. He had blundered in his gladness straight to the edge of his whole secret, and he caught himself only just in time and said, evenly, "I saw your father's hand in the margins the day of the fire. I have a memory for such things. Forgive me, I only meant that I am glad something was saved." And he had passed on before she could answer, before she could see in his face the thing that had leapt up in him at the sight of her cradling that green book on a stone bench in the sun. But he had felt her eyes on his back the whole length of the walk, and he knew, riding home that evening, that he had frightened himself, that he had come within a word of undoing the whole careful secret, and that the reason he had come so close was that he wanted, with an ache that was becoming difficult to govern, to be known to her, to have her look at him and understand that the books came from him. That someone in the wide, indifferent world had seen her kneel in the gravel, and had spent a fortune and a season in the quiet labor of giving her father back to her, 1 volume at a time. He could not tell her. To tell her was to end it, to turn the impossible mercy into a duke's courtship, with all the ruin that entailed. And so he rode home to Ashcombe and his 10,000 books and his cold-ordered solitude, and he sat again in the dark, and he thought of a white face going red on a stone bench in the sun, and he understood with the slow terror of a man watching a fire take hold in a house he cannot leave, that he had fallen in love with Rosamond Clare, wholly and without remedy, and that the very thing he was doing to save her, the secret, the silence, the patient anonymous mercy, was the thing that ensured he could never have her, and that he would go on doing it regardless, every volume of it to the end, because her having her father back mattered more to him than his having her, and that this, though he had never read it in any of his 10,000 books, was perhaps the only definition of love he had ever entirely believed. There was one meeting, that spring, that Gabriel had not contrived and could not have contrived, and it did more to undo him than all his careful calling at the Grange, precisely because it was unarranged. He was in Pettifer's shop on an ordinary market morning, bent with the bookseller over the ledgers in the dim back room, when the bell on the street door jangled and a voice, her voice, low and clear, a voice he had heard say, "They are not yours to give across a burning morning," and had not stopped hearing since asked Mr. Pettifer's boy whether the shop had any cheap odd volume of Cowper, for she wished to make a gift and could spend but a shilling. Gabriel went still. Through the gap in the curtain that divided the back room from the shop he could see her, Rosamond Clare, in her made-over gray gown and a plain straw bonnet, sent into town on some errand of her aunt's and stealing, plainly, 10 minutes of it for herself among the only riches she had ever cared for. She did not know he was there. She was turning over the shilling box with the absorbed, unself-conscious pleasure of a person who believes herself unobserved, and Gabriel watched her through the curtain and could not, for a moment, make himself move, for there is a particular helplessness in seeing unseen the private face of someone one loves. Pettifer, quick as ever, made to rise and attend the shop himself, to spare his customer and his patron a meeting that could only be awkward. But Gabriel put a hand on the bookseller's arm and shook his head, and then against every dictate of the careful game he had been playing all spring, out of a hunger he could not master, he rose himself, and went through the curtain into the shop, as though he were any gentleman browsing, and said, with as much unconcern as he could counterfeit, "Miss Clare, good morning. You are hunting, Cowper, I think I heard. May I be of any use? I know Pettifer's shelves rather too well." She startled and colored and dropped a small curtsy, and he saw the wariness come up in her, the trained flinch of a dependent surprised by her betters. And then, because they were in a bookshop and not a parlor, because there was no aunt at her elbow and no Adelaide at the pianoforte, because the shop smelled of old leather and the shilling box was open between them, he watched the wariness give way by degrees to something freer. He found the Cowper for her, a shabby odd volume, the task, worth perhaps ninepence, and she said it was for Suki, the kitchen girl, who had asked what the poem was that spoke of the sofa, and had never owned a book in her life. And Gabriel, hearing that a girl who possessed almost nothing was spending a stolen shilling to give a kitchen maid her first book, had to turn away a moment and pretend to examine a shelf. They talked. They talked in the end for the better part of an hour, there among Pettifer's shelves, while the market went on outside and the bookseller kept discreetly to his back room. And it was the first time Gabriel had spoken with Rosamond Clare at any length with no third person by to constrain them, and he found it was as he had hoped and feared, that her mind, given room, was a wonder, quick and deep and entirely without pretension, ranging from Cowper to the classics to a fierce small argument about whether it was worse to be cruel or to be cold, in which she held, with a heat that made him wonder what she was thinking of, that coldness was the worse. For the cruel at least felt something and might be reached, whereas the cold had walled themselves off past reaching, and did their harm without even the excuse of passion. Gabriel, who had spent 11 years being called the coldest man in the county, received this in silence, and did not defend himself, and thought that she had described the man he had been more exactly than anyone had ever done, and that she did not know she was describing him, and that he wished with a sudden ache to tell her that she had, that very winter, without knowing it, reached the cold man and warmed him past all his walls, and that she must never call herself powerless again. For she had done a thing to a duke that no one else alive had managed. He said none of it. He said only, when the hour was spent and she gathered her ninepenny Cowper and made to go, "You spoke just now of the cold being past reaching. I do not think that is always true, Miss Clare. I have seen a cold man reached. It wanted only someone honest enough to say a true thing to his face when everyone else had spent years telling him what he wished to hear. It is rarer than you would think, that kind of honesty, but it is not powerless. It is very nearly the most powerful thing there is." And he had bowed and let her go, before she could answer or he could say more. And he had watched through the bow window as she crossed the market square with her ninepenny book pressed to her plain grey figure among all the country traffic, and had understood that he had, in an hour among the shilling boxes, given away rather more of himself than in all the careful months of calling, and that he did not regret it, and that she had gone out into the market square carrying, along with the Cowper, a puzzle he had not meant to hand her, for she had glanced back once from the door, with a new and thoughtful look, as though a cold duke's words about a cold man reached had set something turning in her that would not soon stop. The hour in the bookshop cost Gabriel dear in the weeks that followed, for it made the ordeal of Wanborough harder to bear. Having once spoken with Rosamond freely, as an equal, among the shelves, he found it a torment past describing to sit again in Mrs. Marsh's crowded parlour and be blandly attentive to Adelaide while Rosamond poured the tea in silence. And yet he continued to go, because to stay away was to lose even the sight of her, and a man in love will endure a great deal of the wrong company for a glimpse of the right. He came in the course of those weeks to understand Adelaide Marsh better than he wished to, and to pity her. She was not, he decided, a bad girl at bottom. She was a manufactured one. Her mother had taken a lively, vain, ordinary young woman and drilled her from the cradle into a machine for making a great marriage, filling her head with the peerage and her days with accomplishments she had no love for, until the girl had no self left that had not been shaped to the single purpose of catching a title. Gabriel watched Adelaide perform. The three loud pieces on the pianoforte, the recited genealogies, the arch-practiced remarks her mother had planted in her mouth. And he saw, once or twice, beneath the performance, a flicker of something weary and trapped, a young woman dimly aware that she was being made to sing for a prize she did not understand and was not sure she wanted. He was gentle with her for that reason, gentler than the game required. And Adelaide, who had been taught to see him only as a coronet to be won, seemed puzzled by the gentleness, and grew in his presence very slightly more herself, and less her mother's instrument, which her mother observed with satisfaction and entirely misread. It was on one such afternoon that Gabriel witnessed the small scene that decided him, past any further doubt, on what he meant to do. Mrs. Marsh had swept out to harry a servant, and Adelaide had gone to the window, and Rosamond, clearing the tea-things, had passed near her cousin. And Gabriel, unnoticed by the door, had seen Adelaide say something to Rosamond in a low, sharp voice, and had seen Rosamond flush and answer quietly and go on with her work, and had seen Adelaide's face afterward not triumphant, as her mother's would have been, but obscurely ashamed, a girl who has been trained to unkindness performing it out of habit and half-hating herself in the doing. And he had thought, there are two victims in this house, not one. The niece the aunt starves openly, and the daughter the aunt starves in a subtler way, by feeding her nothing but ambition until she forgets she was ever meant to be a person. And he had resolved, watching the two young women, the one bowed over the tea-things with her quiet, unbreakable dignity, the other at the window ashamed of her own cruelty, that when the reckoning came, as he now felt sure it must, he would try, if he could, to free them both, the one into the life and the love she deserved, and the other, if it were possible, from the mother who had made her a weapon. He said something of this to Pettifer over the ledgers the following week, and the bookseller, ticking off a recovered volume, remarked that his Grace had set out to rescue a library and was in a fair way to rescuing a whole household, and that it was a strange thing how one act of pity, once truly begun, kept widening, like a stone dropped in a pond, until a man who had thought merely to save some books found he had taken on the mending of everything the books touched. Gabriel had not answered, but he had carried the words home and turned them over in his library that night and found them true. He had ridden out of his 11-year solitude on an impulse of pity for a heap of burning paper, and the pity had widened, ring on ring, until it had reached not only Rosamond but the kitchen girl Sukey and the ashamed cousin Adelaide and the old bookseller himself, and most of all and most unexpectedly Gabriel Thorne, who had been the coldest and most walled off of them all, and who found that spring the wall going down stone by stone, and did not any longer wish to build it back. Summer came, and with it, two developments that ran against each other like currents in a strait, and between them the quiet life Gabriel had built out of secret books began to grind toward a reckoning. The first was that Rosamond began to guess. She was too intelligent not to. A book might arrive from nowhere once and be a marvel, but when they came week upon week, always her father's, always the ones he had loved best, arriving by a dozen impossible chances that no accident could explain, the marvel became a mystery, and Rosamond set her mind to the mystery with the quiet persistence of a scholar's daughter. Sukey, questioned, held loyally to her charge and knew nothing, and Rosamond, unable to trace the books upstream, began instead to watch and to think and to narrow her suspicion week by week toward the one new fact in her narrow life, that a duke had ridden out of a burning morning and paid to save what he could of her father's books, and had begun thereafter to call at a house he had never troubled to notice before, and had looked at her twice, in a way no one had looked at her in years. She did not know, she could not know, the thing was too improbable and she had schooled herself too long against hope. But she suspected, and the suspicion changed her subtly in a way Gabriel caught across Mrs. Marsh's parlor and treasured and feared in equal measure. She began to watch him back. When he came now, she would find, in the smooth, cruel economy of that house, small silent ways to be near enough to observe him, and he would feel her gray eyes on him, thoughtful, weighing, and he would keep his own face a careful blank, and the not knowing whether she had guessed became a kind of exquisite torment that he would not have traded for peace. The second development was Mr. Bartle. Mr. Ephraim Bartle was a widower of 56, a tallow chandler grown rich, coarse, and gouty, who had bought a small estate on the far side of Ashwick and now desired, as such men do, a wife young enough to nurse his gout and gentle enough to lend his money the polish of good blood. He had seen Rosamond at church. He had made inquiries. He had learned that she was well born, penniless, dependent, and therefore, in the calculus of such men, available, and he had approached Mrs. Marsh, who received his proposal as the answer to a prayer she had not known she was praying. For Rosamond to Mrs. Marsh was a standing vexation and a standing expense, a poor relation who ate and must be clothed and could not be married off because she had no portion and would not, the ungrateful creature, make herself agreeable to the sort of man who might overlook the want of one. And here at last was such a man, rich enough not to mind the empty purse, old enough not to be particular and eager. That he was coarse and gouty and 30 years, the girl's senior weighed nothing at all against the twin blessings of being rid of Rosamond forever, and gaining a connection to Mr. Bartle's money. Mrs. Marsh accepted him on Rosamond's behalf almost before he had finished asking, and informed Rosamond of her good fortune that same evening in the tone of a woman conferring an undeserved gift. Gabriel learned of it 3 days later from Pettifer, who had it from Sukey, who had heard the whole scene through the parlor door. How Mrs. Marsh had told Rosamond she was to marry Mr. Bartle, and how Rosamond had refused, quietly at first and then, when pressed, absolutely. And how Mrs. Marsh had then shown the girl, with terrible clarity, exactly how narrow her world was. She might marry Mr. Bartle, her aunt had said, or she might leave the Grange, for Mrs. Marsh would not keep, another year, an ungrateful dependent who cost money and would not lift the burden of herself by taking the one respectable offer she was ever likely to get. There was no third road. Marry Bartle, or go out into the world with no money, no character, and no protection, to end as a governess if she were lucky, and as something worse if she were not. Mrs. Marsh gave her a fortnight to be sensible. Gabriel sat in his library with Pettifer's careful account in his hand, and felt something in him go very cold and very still, the way the surface of a deep pool goes still when the current beneath it has begun to run hard. He could stop it. That was the first thing he understood, and the understanding was a kind of vertigo. He could stop it with a word. He was the Duke of Ashcombe. He need only make plain that his interest in Wamborough Grange was Rosamond, and Mr. Bartle would evaporate, and Mrs. Marsh would fling her niece at him as eagerly as she now flung her daughter, and the whole cruelty would collapse before the simple weight of his rank. He could ride to the Grange tomorrow and end Rosamond's misery in 5 minutes. And in ending it, ruin her. For if he declared himself now in the teeth of the Bartle match, the county would say precisely what Pettifer had warned they would say, that the sly dependent had played a deep game, angled for the Duke over her own cousin, thrown over an honest offer to snare a great one, and Mrs. Marsh, cheated of both her ambitions in one stroke, would say it loudest and cruelest of all, and would poison the very triumph she pretended to bless. Rosamond would go to Ashcombe not as a bride freely chosen, but as a schemer who had won, hated by her aunt, scorned by her cousin, whispered of by the whole neighborhood, and the poison would follow her through the great doors of Ashcombe and into her married life and never quite wash out. Gabriel had seen a marriage poisoned so, in his own family a generation back, and had watched what it did to the woman who bore the poison, and he would not do that to Rosamond. He would not save her from Bartle by handing her to the county's malice. But neither could he do nothing. To do nothing was to let her be sold to a gouty chandler or cast penniless into the world, and either was unthinkable. He needed a third road, where the aunt swore there was none, and he sat up the whole of that night in his library among his 10,000 silent books, and he found it, or the beginning of it, in the small hours, and it was this. He would not stop the Bartle match by declaring himself. He would stop it by making it unnecessary, by giving Rosamond the one thing that would set her free of the whole trap without owing anyone anything, without scandal, without a name attached. He would give her independence. It could be done. A dead scholar might have left, tucked among his effects, more than mildewed books, might have left, say, a small annuity, a modest sum in the funds, overlooked in the confusion of a hurried and grasping settlement, and only now, through the diligence of a country lawyer, come to light. Such things happened. Such things could be made to happen, by a duke with money and patience and a discreet man of law, in a manner that no one could disprove and no one could trace, so that Rosamond Clare should wake one morning to find herself possessed of an income of her own, not a fortune, but enough to refuse Mr. Bartle and leave the Grange and live, plainly and freely, beholden to no one, in a cottage of her own with her father's returning books around her. It would cost Gabriel a great deal and gain him nothing. She would never know it was he. She would think it her father's own belated legacy, which was, he thought, exactly as it should be, for it was only what her father would have left her had the world been just. And it would set her free. And a free woman, unlike a rescued one, could not be called a schemer, for she would owe no one anything, and could choose afterward in her own time and by her own light, whatever and whomever she wished, or no one at all, and be content. He put it to Pettifer, and to his own grave, discreet lawyer, Mr. Enderby, the next day. Enderby, who had served the Ashcombes 30 years and asked few questions, saw at once both the delicacy and the danger of it, and warned his master soberly that such a fiction, however kindly meant, was a fraud in the eye of the law, and that if it were ever uncovered, it would look very ill a duke secretly settling money on an unmarried gentlewoman under a false story, and would ruin the very reputation it was meant to protect. But he saw also that his master's mind was made up, below argument, in the place where Gabriel's mind had been made up since the morning of the fire, and being a good lawyer he set himself, having entered his caution, to making the thing as sound and unimpeachable as it could be made. It took 3 weeks to arrange, and the fortnight Mrs. Marsh had given ran out first, and there was a bad week in which Gabriel, forbidden by his own long game to intervene openly, had to sit at Ashcombe and trust the machinery to work in time while a gouty chandler pressed his suit 5 miles off and a hard woman bore down on a cornered girl. He very nearly broke and rode to the Grange a dozen times. What held him was Suki's reports, relayed through Pettifer, that Miss Rosamond had not yielded, that she had told her aunt, white and steady, that she would go for a governess before she would marry Mr. Bartle, that she was packing, quietly, her few things and her returning books, preparing to walk out of Wanborough Grange with nothing rather than be sold. It was the courage of the gravel again, the "they are not yours to give," and it wrung Gabriel's heart and steadied it at once, for he thought, "She will not be sold. She would rather starve free than eat as a slave, and if I can only reach her with the means before her aunt reaches her with the ultimatum, she need do neither." He reached her first, by 4 days. Mr. Enderby, in the character of a scrupulous country lawyer lately charged with winding up an old and tangled trust, presented himself at Wanborough Grange on a bright July morning with a leather case of papers, and the grave announcement that in the course of settling certain long-dormant affairs of the late Reverend Josiah Clare, an annuity had come to light, a small provision the reverend gentleman had made years since for his daughter, and in the disorder following his death, entirely overlooked, amounting to £80 a year, secured in the funds, payable to Miss Rosamond Clare and to no other from that quarter-day forward for the term of her natural life. £80 a year. It was not wealth, but it was, to a penniless dependent facing a gouty chandler or the road, the difference between slavery and freedom, and Gabriel, who was not there to see it and would never be there to see any of it, had Pettifer's account of it within the day and kept that one too, and it was among the dearest of them all. For Suki said that, when the lawyer had gone and the thing was understood, Rosamond Clare had walked out of the house and down through the garden to the stone bench where she read, and had sat there a long while with the little green Horace in her lap, not weeping, only breathing, like someone who has been under water a long time and has come up at last into the air. And that Mrs. Marsh had watched from the window with a face like a thundercloud, cheated of both her purposes at a stroke, unable to compel a niece who no longer depended on her bread, and that Mr. Bartle, informed that Miss Clare had come into an independence and would not have him, had taken his gout and his tallow money off to press some other cornered girl, and troubled Wamborough no more. Gabriel had bought her freedom, and she did not know it and thought it her father's, which was as it should be. And he told himself, sitting again in the dark of his great library, that this was enough, that he had wanted only her safety, only her freedom, and that having it, he could be content to love her from 5 miles off and never speak, and let her live her plain free life among her returning books, and ask nothing. He told himself this with great firmness and at considerable length. He did not believe a word of it. For a free woman may choose, and the thought that Rosamond Clare was now, for the first time in her life, free to choose and might choose someone, and that the someone would not be a duke who could never declare himself without ruining her, that thought sat in Gabriel Thorne's chest like a swallowed coal, and he understood that in setting her free he had set free also his own last hope of ever, by any road, reaching her, and that he had done it gladly, and that this was either the noblest thing he had ever done or the most foolish, and that he could no longer, in the small hours, entirely tell the two apart. The weeks after the annuity were the strangest of that strange year, for Gabriel had got exactly what he had told himself he wanted: Rosamond safe, Rosamond free, Rosamond delivered from the gouty chandler and the cruel aunt. And he found that having it brought him no peace at all, only a restlessness that would not let him settle to his books or his correspondence or any of the old comforts. He had set her free. And a free woman may go anywhere, choose anyone, need no one. And the very completeness of the freedom he had given her stood now between them like a wall of his own building, for how could he ever approach her, knowing that behind every step he took lay the secret machinery that had made her free, and that to declare himself was to reveal the machinery, and to reveal the machinery was to turn her hard-won independence back into a duke's arrangement. He said as much to Lady Cordelia, or nearly as much, one grey July evening in her elegant little drawing-room at the park's edge, over the chessboard they had shared since he was a boy. He had told her by now more of the truth, not all, not yet the annuity, whose fiction he still guarded as a danger to Rosamond, but that the girl was free of her aunt and set up modestly on her own, and that he did not see how a duke might honorably approach a young woman he had, in ways she did not know, already so deeply obliged. "You have tied yourself in a very fine knot," Lady Cordelia observed, taking his bishop. "You have done this poor girl so much secret good that you can no longer do her the open good of loving her, for fear the secret good should come to light and spoil it. It is the most elaborate way of thwarting yourself that I have witnessed in a long life of watching clever men thwart themselves, and they are very ingenious at it. Gabriel." She looked at him over the board. "There is only one way out of a knot like that, and it is the way you will like least, because it requires you to give up the thing you have relied on all your life, which is control. You must tell her the truth. Not now, perhaps not all at once, but you must resolve that she will one day know the whole of it from your own lips, and that when she knows it she will be free to think what she likes and do what she likes, including despise you. As long as you keep the secret, you keep power over her, the power of the unseen benefactor, which is the most insidious power there is, for it cannot be refused or repaid or even acknowledged. You will never have her honestly while you hold that power. You must be willing to lay it down and stand before her with empty hands and let her judge you knowing all. It is a great risk. She may not forgive the deception. But there is no other door out of your knot, my dear, and I think you know it, and I think that is why you cannot settle to your books, for a part of you has already seen the door and is afraid of it. Gabriel moved a night without seeing it, and if she does not forgive it, then you will have loved her honestly and lost her honestly, said his aunt, which is a clean grief and heals. It is the other kind that festers, the love hoarded and hidden and never risked. I know. I have carried the festering kind for 45 years. Do not choose it, Gabriel, whatever else you choose. Checkmate, by the way. You have been playing like a man in love the whole evening, which is to say very badly. And she began, briskly, to reset the pieces, and Gabriel sat looking at the beaten board and understood that she was entirely right, and that the day was coming, sooner or later, when he would have to lay the whole truth before Rosamond Clare and stand with empty hands and be judged. And he did not yet know that the day would be chosen for him, and cruelly, by another hand entirely. For while Gabriel wrestled with his knot, his enemy was quietly arming. Mrs. Honoria Marsh had been cheated of both her purposes at a single stroke, robbed of the daughter's ducal marriage she had schemed for, and of the niece's profitable disposal she had counted on, and cheated women of Mrs. Marsh's stamp do not grieve, they seek. She could not at first understand how the thing had happened, how a penniless dependent had, in the very hour of her extremity, come suddenly into an independence out of a father's estate that Mrs. Marsh herself had stripped to the plaster and knew to contain nothing. It made no sense, and Mrs. Marsh, whatever her cruelties, was not stupid, and a thing that made no sense was to her a thing with a hidden cause, and she set herself, with the patience of malice, to find it. It was ill fortune Gabriel's and Rosamond's that put the means in her way. Mr. Enderby, the Duke's grave and careful lawyer, had lately been obliged to discharge a clerk, one Sela's crook, a sharp-faced young man turned off for drunkenness and light fingers, and Sela's crook, who had copied the annuity papers in the course of his duties and understood exactly what they were and were not, went out into the world nursing a grievance and looking to sell whatever he had. He did not at first know what his knowledge was worth, but market towns are small and gossip runs, and Crook drank in the same Ashwick tap-room where the Grange servants drank, and heard the tale of the strange legacy that had rescued Miss Clare, and understood, with the swift instinct of his kind, that he possessed the secret behind it and that the secret had a price. And he found his way, before the summer was out, to Mrs. Honoria Marsh, and named his price and was paid it. So it was that Mrs. Marsh came into possession, that autumn, of the two facts that were to arm her: that Rosamond's annuity was no legacy but a forgery paid for by the Duke of Ashcombe, and that the same Duke had for half a year been secretly restoring the girl's library. Gabriel knew nothing of this. He knew only that Rosamond had left the Grange, and taken a cottage of her own on the Ashwick road, and set up housekeeping there with the faithful Sukey, and that this changed everything, for a duke could not call on a dependent without ruin, but might call on an independent gentlewoman of good birth without a breath of scandal, provided the forms were kept, and that the wall his own generosity had built between them had, by the simple fact of her taking a house of her own, developed at last a door. He did not yet see the storm gathering 5 miles off in a widow's parlour. He saw only the door, and through it at last, after a year of loving her in the dark, the possibility of loving her in the daylight, and he made ready to call at Lark's End with a heart that had not been so light and so afraid at once since he was 9 years old and had been given the pony. Rosamond Clare left Wanborough Grange within the month. She took, on Pettifer's quiet recommendation, a small stone cottage on the Ashwick road called Lark's End, 4 rooms and a garden and a view of the down, at a rent her £80 could bear with a little management, and she furnished it with almost nothing, for she had almost nothing and she did not care, for the almost nothing was hers. Sukey, given warning and a character by Pettifer, left the Grange too and came to keep house for her former mistress at Lark's End for her board and a small wage, glad past telling to be quit of Mrs. Marsh, and the 2 young women set up together in the little cottage on the down, and were, by every account that reached Gabriel, poor and free and happy. And the books kept coming. That was the strange, sweet continuation of it. Now that Rosamond had a house of her own, the returning volumes had a home to return to, and Gabriel and Pettifer bent to the recovery with fresh energy, and Lark's End began. Shelf by shelf, board by board, for Rosamond built the shelves herself, with Sukey holding the nails, having no money to hire a joiner to fill with the Reverend Clare's library, arriving still by its dozen impossible chances, out of nowhere, asking nothing. She had a home for them now, and they came to it, and the empty, ruined room at Wanborough that had haunted Gabriel's imagination was answered, at last, by a small, bright, growing room at Lark's End, and he thought, watching it fill through Pettifer's reports, that he had never in his life done anything that gave him such deep and quiet joy. For now, at last, he could call. That was the gift her freedom had given him that he had not dared to hope for. A penniless dependent could not be visited by a duke without ruin, but an independent gentlewoman of good birth, mistress of her own small house, might receive a neighbor's calls without a breath of scandal, provided the forms were kept and a companion were Bayansuki was ever by, and the forms were scrupulously kept. And so the Duke of Ashcombe began, that autumn, to call at Lark's End openly in the daylight, as a neighbor and a fellow-lover of books. And for the first time since the morning of the fire, he could sit in a room with Rosamond Clare and speak to her as himself. They spoke of books at first because books were safe, and because books were, in truth, the country they most deeply shared. He found her learning astonished him. Her father had taught her Latin and a little Greek, and had let her range at will through the whole of his library, so that she had read more widely and thought more freely than any woman and most men of Gabriel's acquaintance. And she was not cowed by him, which delighted him beyond measure, for she would take up a point and turn it and hand it back to him sharpened, and disagree with him roundly over Dante or Lucretius or the merits of the new poets, and forget, in the heat of an argument about a book, to be shy or deferential or aware that she was a poor gentlewoman disputing with a duke. In those hours she was simply Rosamond, and he was simply a mind she was pleased to spar with, and Gabriel, who had spent 11 years in a solitude he had called contentment, discovered week by autumn week what contentment actually was, and how little his old imitation of it had resembled the real thing. And slowly, under the safe cover of the books, the other thing grew. It grew in the pauses. It grew in the way she would fall silent, sometimes in the middle of an argument, and look at him with that thoughtful weighing gray gaze, as though she were reading him as she read a difficult page. It grew in the way he found himself inventing reasons to prolong a call, to come again sooner, to bring some volume from his own library that bore on their last disputant in the way she began, he thought, to watch the road on the days he was expected. It grew in 100 small unspoken things, the whole slow, tender vocabulary of two reserved and wary people falling, against their every intention, in love. And neither of them spoke it, for he dared not. Still the annuity was a secret, the books were a secret, his whole part in her freedom was a secret, and he could not court her while so much lay hidden between them, could not ask for her hand while his hand was the invisible one that had built her whole new life. And she, for her part, held back for reasons of her own that he could only guess at, some deep proud reserve, some wariness of a happiness too large to trust. It was, though he did not know it, that same wariness working in her that had also set her, all this while, to solving the mystery of the books. And it was at Lark's End, that autumn, in the very sweetness of their growing friendship, that Rosamond Clare came at last within reach of the truth. For she was not a fool, and the coincidences had grown too many. The books arriving still. The annuity discovered by a lawyer she had never heard of, out of a father's estate she had watched be stripped to the walls. The Duke of Ashcombe, who had ridden out of a burning morning to save what he could and had, ever since, by one improbable turn after another, been present at every mercy that had befallen her. She had begun, that autumn, to lay these things side by side, in the quiet of the little book-room she had built with her own hands, and to see the shape they made. And the shape frightened her, because if it were true it meant that her whole free, proud, independent life, the life she had built and furnished and paid for and been so quietly triumphant in, was not her own at all, but a thing given secretly by a man. That she had not escaped dependence but only exchanged a cruel dependence she could see for a kind one she could not, and that even her father's returning books, the dearest proofs she had that the world had not forgotten her, were not the world relenting but one man spending, and that she had, without knowing it, without consenting to it, been for half a year the object of a charity so vast and so total that it had remade her entire existence while she believed herself free. Gabriel saw the change in her before he understood it. Through November her manner altered, the ease went out of their arguments. She grew watchful in a new way, guarded, sometimes almost cold, and he could not think what he had done and feared he had somehow betrayed himself, shown too plainly what he felt, frightened her with the pressure of a love he had tried so hard to hide. He grew careful, and then anxious, and the anxiety made him stiff, and the stiffness made her stiffer, and the beautiful open autumn of their friendship began to close over with a frost that neither of them named and neither knew how to break. And then, on a raw gray day at the very end of November, the frost broke of itself, and not gently. He had come to Lark's End with a book a fine copy of the very Aldine Ovid he had bought out of her father's fire, which he had rebound where the flames had scorched it, and which he had resolved, that day, to give her openly as a neighbor's gift, the one book he could give her by his own hand without unraveling the rest, thinking it might thaw whatever had chilled between them. He found her in the book-room, alone. Suki, unusually, was out. And Rosamond was standing very straight by the window with a letter in her hand, and her face, when she turned it to him, was white and terrible and blazing, and he knew at once before she spoke that everything was known. "I have had a letter," she said, "from my aunt." Her voice was very quiet and very steady, the gravel voice, the "they are not yours to give" voice. "She writes to congratulate me. She has learned, she does not say how, but she has learned, a most interesting thing which she thought it her Christian duty to share with me lest I be deceived. She has learned that my annuity was no legacy of my father's at all, that there was no dormant trust, no overlooked provision. That the whole of it was invented and paid for and settled upon me under a false story by a man, and that the same man has spent this half-year a small fortune buying back my father's library volume by volume from every corner of England, and having it conveyed to me in secret by a kitchen girl so that I should think it. So that I should think it, her voice cracked at last, and she pressed the back of her hand to her mouth and mastered it and went on. So that I should think it a miracle. And she names the man, your Grace. Shall I tell you the name my aunt has written in this letter, or will you save us both the trouble and tell me yourself to my face at last whether it is true?" Gabriel stood in the doorway of the book-room he had filled, with the rebound Ovid in his hands, and looked at the white blazing face of the woman he loved, and understood that the reckoning he had staved off since March had come at last, and come at the worst possible hour, sprung on her by the cruelest possible messenger, in the cruelest possible way, and that there was now only one thing left in the world that he could give her, which was the truth, plainly, whatever it cost him. "It is true," he said, "all of it, every word. Ask me anything you wish, and I will tell you, and I will not lie to you again, for I find I cannot bear to, and I should never have begun." He set the Ovid down on the table between them very gently, as a man lays down a weapon. "The books are from me. The annuity is from me. I saw you kneel in the gravel, and I could not bear it, and I have spent this whole year, in the only ways I could contrive that would not ruin you, trying to give you back what was taken. That is the truth, Rosamond. I am sorry for the manner of it. I am not sorry for the doing of it, and I am wholly at your mercy." "At my mercy," Rosamond repeated. She laughed, a short broken sound with no mirth in it. "You are the Duke of Ashcombe. You have never been at anyone's mercy in your life, and you are not at mine now, whatever you please to say. Do you know what you have done? Do you understand it at all, or does it look, from up where you stand, like nothing but kindness?" She came away from the window, and there was a trembling in her whole body that was not fear. "I had one thing, your Grace. In the whole of my life I had one thing that was truly mine, and it was not the books, though I loved them. It was that I had earned my freedom myself. My aunt offered to sell me to a gouty old man, and I said no, and I packed my things to walk out into the world with nothing rather than be bought. And then a legacy came, my father's own, come laid out of the wreck of his estate, and I thought, there you see you were right to refuse, you were right to keep your self-respect. The world is hard, but it is not entirely without justice, and you have won your freedom by your own courage and your father's love. That was the thing I had, not the money. The story. That I had stood firm and been rewarded and owed no one anything, and was, for the first time in my life, wholly my own woman." Her voice dropped, and the drop was worse than any shout. "And it was a lie. There was no justice. There was no father's legacy. There was only a man, watching from 5 miles off, deciding what should become of me and paying for it and not troubling to ask whether I wished to be decided for. I did not win my freedom. You bought it and handed it to me in a false wrapping, and let me spend 6 months being proud of a courage that had, it turns out, changed nothing at all, because you had already arranged the whole ending before I ever refused Mr. Bartle. My refusal meant nothing. My courage meant nothing. I was never in any danger because you were always going to catch me. You took even that from me. You took the one thing I did myself and made it a scene in a play you were staging, and you did not tell me I was in a play." Gabriel stood very still. Every word went into him and lodged because every word was just. He had thought of the annuity as a gift of freedom, and had never once seen, until she laid it before him now, that a freedom given in secret is not freedom at all but only a gentler cage, and that in sparing her the world's cruelty he had also, without meaning to, robbed her of the one victory that had been truly hers. "You are right," he said. "I did not see it. I saw only that you were in danger and that I could not bear it, and I never once asked myself whether you would rather have been left to win or lose your own battle than be quietly rescued from having to fight it. That was arrogance. It was the arrogance of a man so used to arranging the world that it never occurred to him a person might prefer to be consulted about her own life. I am ashamed of it. I would undo it if I could." He paused. "But I will not tell you I am ashamed of the whole of it, Rosamond, because that would be another lie, and I have done with lying to you. I'm not ashamed that I saved the books. I'm not ashamed that I could not bear to see you sold. If the manner was wrong, and it was wrong, secret and high-handed, and blind the heart of it was not charity. I want you to understand that, whatever else you never forgive. I did not do these things because I pitied a poor dependent. I did them because—" He stopped. The words he had guarded for a year stood at the edge of the silence, and he understood that to speak them now in this hour might look like the last and worst manipulation of all, a man playing his highest card to escape a reckoning, and he understood also that not to speak them would be one more thing hidden, and that he had sworn to hide nothing further. So he spoke them plainly and let them fall where they would. "I did them because I love you. I have loved you since the morning of the fire. I did the whole of it in secret because I am a duke and you were a penniless dependent and I could not court you without ruining you. And so I loved you the only way that could not harm you, from behind a curtain, spending money that could not be traced, asking nothing, taking nothing, wanting nothing but that you should be safe and free and have your father back. That is the truth. It is the last truth I have been keeping, and now you have all of them. And I know how it must sound, spoken now at bay, and I cannot help how it sounds. I can only tell you that it is true and has been true the whole time under everything." The silence that followed was very long. Outside, the raw November wind moved over the down and rattled the casement. Rosamond had gone still at last, the trembling stopped, and she stood looking at him across the little book-room he had filled, and he could not read her face at all, and he did not try. He had said the whole of it, and there was nothing left to do but stand and be judged. "You should go," she said at last, very low. I cannot think with you here. There is too much of it, and it has all come at once, and I cannot tell any longer which of my feelings are my own and which are only what you have arranged for me to feel. You have been arranging my feelings for a year, your grace, without my knowing it, and I need to be free of you a little while, truly free, to find out what I think when there is no duke in the room deciding it. Please go. I am not sending you away forever. I do not know what I am doing, but I cannot do it with you standing there looking at me as though your whole life hung on my next word." "It does," said Gabriel, but he went. He went out into the raw gray afternoon and rode home to Ashcombe through a rising storm, and he did not know, as he rode, whether he had lost her or not, and the not knowing was the worst thing he had ever carried. He had told her the truth, all of it, and the truth had been terrible, and he could not tell whether the terribleness of it would burn away her love or only her trust, or both, or neither. He had put his whole life in her hands, as he had said, and she had asked him to leave, and he did not know if the leaving was the end or the beginning of something, and he rode home in the storm not knowing, and passed a night at Ashcombe among his 10,000 books that made the worst nights of his old grief seem, in memory, almost restful. And while he passed that night not knowing, his enemy moved. For Mrs. Honoria Marsh was not done. The letter to Rosamond had been only her first stroke, and its object had been not merely to wound but to arm. She had learned the Duke's secret. She had had it, as it happened, from a discharged clerk of Mr. Enderby's who had copied the annuity papers and turned off for drunkenness, had sold what he knew to the highest bidder, and Mrs. Marsh had bought it in having learned it. This cheated, resentful, vulgar, formidable woman had grasped at once the full ruinous power of what she held. For the thing the Duke had done, however kindly meant, was in the plain eye of the law and the world a scandal of the first order. A duke had secretly, fraudulently, settled money on an unmarried young gentlewoman under a forged story, and had for half a year clandestinely conveyed gifts to her, and had visited her cottage. And there was a name the world had for a young woman on whom a great man secretly settled money and quietly bestowed gifts, and it was not a kind name, and it did not matter in the least that the name was undeserved. Mrs. Marsh understood that she held, in the discharged clerk's information, the means to destroy them both, to ruin the Duke's proud name and to brand Rosamond before the whole county as a kept woman. And she understood, being a woman of business under the bombazine, that a weapon that can destroy is a weapon that can be sold not to use. She wrote to Gabriel the very day after she wrote to Rosamond. Her letter to the Duke was a marvel of oily menace. She was, she wrote, a poor widow much wronged, deprived by his Grace's secret machinations of a niece's natural gratitude and a daughter's just prospects. She knew all the annuity, the forgery, the books, the visits, and she knew too how the world would view such matters, and how tender a great name was to such a breath. But she was a Christian woman and desired no scandal, and was sure his Grace, being generous, would wish to make some suitable provision for the widow he had so injured, in exchange for which she would of course say nothing and burn the papers, and let the whole sad business rest. She named, delicately, a figure. She was, in short, blackmailing him, and she had timed it with a low cunning, for the very hour she calculated he would be most desperate to keep the secret, not knowing, for she could not know, that Rosamond already knew the whole of it, and that the one thing in the world Gabriel Thorn no longer had left to protect by paying was a secret that was already out. Gabriel read Mrs. Marsh's letter at Ashcombe on the grey morning after the storm, and something happened in him as he read it that had not happened in 11 years, or perhaps ever. The grief and the fear and the not knowing of the long night burned away, all at once, and left behind a cold, clear, terrible anger, the anger of a proud man who has been humbled by love into seeing his own faults truly, and who will not, having paid that price, stand by and watch a cruel woman use those same faults to destroy the person he loves. He had been humbled. Rosamond had humbled him rightly, and he had accepted it, and it had made him, for the first time in his life, a man rather than a duke. And now a woman in black bombazine proposed to take the very tenderness that had unmade his pride, and turn it into a knife at Rosamond's throat. And Gabriel Thorn rose from his desk with Mrs. Marsh's letter in his hand and rang for his horse, and rode not to Lark's End but to Wamborough Grange, because there was a reckoning owing there that only he could pay, and he found, riding to pay it, that he was no longer in the least afraid of anything the world could say or do, and that this too was a gift Rosamond had given him without knowing, the last and greatest of them. She had loved the pride out of him, and a man with no pride left to protect is a man no blackmailer on earth can touch. Mrs. Marsh received him in the very parlour where she had flung her daughter at him all those months, and her handsome pouched face was bright with the particular triumph of a person who believes she holds every card. She had dressed for the interview. She had, Gabriel saw, prepared little cakes. She rose with a great show of injured dignity and began upon a speech about a poor widow's wrongs, and Gabriel let her get 3 sentences into it before he cut across her, quietly, in the voice of 9 generations. "I have had your letter, madam. I have come to give you my answer in person, that there may be no mistaking it. You will have no money from me, not this quarter, nor any quarter, nor ever 1 shilling. The brightness on her face flickered. "Your Grace mistakes his position, I fear. I hold certain papers, certain information, that a gentleman of your Grace's standing would very much regret to see." "You hold nothing," Gabriel said. "You believe you hold a secret. There is no secret. Everything you know Miss Clare already knows. I told her myself yesterday to her face the whole of it. And everything you threat to make public, I intend to make public first and on my own terms, which will draw its every tooth. You imagine you can ruin me by telling the county that the Duke of Ashcombe secretly gave money and books to a penniless gentlewoman he admired. Tell them. Tell them today, I will save you the postage. And then watch, madam, what it profits you, for I mean to marry Miss Clare, openly, before the whole county, in Ashwick Church, with my name and my arms and every honor I possess. And a duke does not secretly keep the woman he openly marries. The moment I marry her, your scandal is nothing but the story of how a great man loved a good woman the only way her circumstances allowed, and did her the honor of making her his duchess. And the only person that story shames is the aunt who burned her father's books to paper a parlor and then tried to sell the burning back to me at a profit. That is the story you will be spreading, madam, if you spread anything. Your own. I should think very carefully in your place about how loudly you wish it told. Mrs. Marsh had gone from red to a mottled gray. You cannot marry her, she said, but the triumph had drained out of her voice and something like panic had come into it. A duke and she has nothing. She is nobody the county will never, my Adelaide. Your Adelaide, said Gabriel, and for the first time there was something almost gentle in it, for he pitied the girl who had been raised a weapon by a woman who loved nothing but ambition. Will do very well, madam, if you will only stop trying to make her a duchess and let her be a woman. She is not unkind at heart, she is only untaught. But that is your affair, and no longer mine, and no longer, I think, one you will conduct at Wamborough Grange, for I fancy the neighborhood's doors will be somewhat less open to you when this morning's business is understood, as it will be understood, for I do not mean to keep it secret, and neither, I imagine, will your kitchen. He drew Mrs. Marsh's own letter from his breast and laid it on the little table beside the untouched cakes. There is your blackmail, madam, in your own hand. I return it to you. I could destroy you with it. A magistrate would call it extortion, and the law would agree. I do not intend to. You have done cruelty enough in your life to be punished without any help from me, and I find, having lately learned the thing myself, that the surest punishment for a hard heart is simply to be left alone with itself. Good day. I do not expect we shall meet again. He was at the door when she found her voice, thin and shaking now, all the bombazine grandeur collapsed. She'll never have you. She's too proud. She sent you off, Suki told my cook she sent you off yesterday, white as a sheet. She'll not be bought, and she'll not be rescued, and she'll not have a man who made a puppet of her. You've lost her, your grace, for all your fine speeches, and I hope it. But Gabriel had already gone out and shut the door on the rest, and it did not matter, because the terrible thing was that in this one thing the hard woman might be right, and he did not know, and there was only one way in the world to find out. He rode to Lark's End. Rosamond opened the door herself. Suki, he could see, hovered anxious in the passage behind her. She had not slept either, he thought. Her face was pale, and there were shadows under the gray eyes, and she looked at him on the doorstep in the raw noon light and did not ask him in, and did not send him away, only stood, waiting, guarded, and he understood that everything now depended on his getting the next words exactly right, and that he had never in his life cared so much about anything, and that he must therefore, as she had taught him, simply tell the truth. I have not come to rescue you, he said. I want that understood before I say anything else, because it is the thing I got most wrong, and I will not get it wrong again. Your aunt wrote to me. She thought to blackmail me, to threaten me with the scandal of everything I did, and to make me pay to keep it quiet. I have just come from her. I did not pay her. I told her I would make the whole of it public myself proudly and marry you before the county, so that her scandal should have no power. And then I told her that whether I marry you is not and never was in her gift or mine, but only in yours, and I have come here to say the same thing to you, and to mean it as I have never meant anything. He stood bareheaded on her doorstep, the Duke of Ashcombe, and he did not command, and he did not arrange, and he did not spend, he only asked. I have taken enough choices from you, Rosamond. I will take no more. I have not come to settle money on you, or to buy back your books, or to arrange your rescue behind a curtain. I have come to stand here in the plain daylight with nothing in my hands and ask you, as one person asks another, with no power over you and no secret between us and nothing left to hide. Will you marry me? Not because it is safe. It will not be quite safe, There will be talk, and your aunt will spread what she can. Not because you owe me anything, you owe me nothing. The annuity is yours whatever you answer, and so are the books, freely and forever with no string upon them. Only if you wish it. Only if, having all the truth at last and being wholly your own free woman, with a house of your own and money of your own and no man deciding anything for you, only if, being all of that, you find that you love me, as I have loved you since the morning of the fire. If you do not, tell me so, and I will go and never trouble you again, and you shall keep your freedom and your books and your peace, and I shall count it a fair price for having once been permitted to know you. The choice is yours, Rosamond. It has never truly been anyone's but yours. I only took a year and a great deal of folly to learn it. She looked at him a long moment on the doorstep, and he watched the gray eyes fill slowly, and the guarded stillness of her face begin, at last, to break. And when she spoke her voice was not steady at all. "Do you know what I have been doing?" she said. "Since you left yesterday, I have been sitting in that room you filled among my father's books trying to be angry with you. I have been telling myself all the true things, that you were high-handed, that you decided my life without asking, that you took my one victory and made it a fiction, that a woman ought to send such a man away and keep her pride. I have been trying all night to keep my pride." A tear went down her cheek and she did not wipe it. "And I could not do it, Gabriel. I could not, because every time I looked round that room at all those books, every single one of them my father's, hunted down from the ends of England and carried here in secret by a man who wanted nothing, who took nothing, who never once let me thank him or even know him. Every time I looked at them I thought, no one has ever loved me like this. No one has ever loved me at all, but especially not like this. Not with money, anyone with money can spend money, but with a whole year of patient, hidden, thankless labor done in the dark, for no reward, only that I should have my father back and be safe and free. And I thought, he is a fool and he is arrogant and he has done it all wrong, and he is the only person in the whole of my life who ever thought I was worth that much trouble, and I could not be angry with that. I tried the whole night and I could not." She was weeping openly now and smiling through it. "You did it all wrong, everything, and I love you, and if you ever again arrange one single thing about my life without asking me first, I will. Do not know what I will do, but you will not enjoy it. Ask me, always ask me. And the answer, Gabriel, to the thing you have asked me now, the answer is yes. Yes. Come in out of the cold, you great foolish generous man, and ask me properly in the room you filled, and I will say it again where my father's books can hear it." Gabriel Thorne crossed the threshold of Lark's End, and Sukey burst into tears in the passage and fled to put on the kettle, and in the little book-room the Duke of Ashcombe took the hands of Rosamond Clare, the hands that had burned pulling books from a fire, and asked her properly, and she said yes again, 3 times, once for herself and once for her father, and once, she said, for the girl in the gravel who had stopped expecting rescue, and who had been right not to expect it. Because what had come in the end was so much larger and stranger and better than rescue that she had had no name for it, and had it now, and the name was love. They were married in Ashwick Church in the New Year, openly, before the whole county, with the Duke's name and arms and every honor he possessed, exactly as he had promised Mrs. Marsh they would be. And the county, which had prepared to be scandalized, found instead that it could not resist a story so much better than scandal. The reclusive scholar-duke who had ridden out of a burning morning and spent a year and a fortune secretly giving a wronged girl her dead father back, one book at a time, and had loved her the only way her poverty allowed, asking nothing, until her own freedom set them both at liberty to choose. Told so, and Gabriel took care that it should be told so, for he had learned the power of a true story truly told. It was not a scandal at all, but the finest romance the neighborhood had known in a generation, and the same doors that had opened grudgingly to a bookish recluse now flew wide for the Duke and his learned Duchess, and the same tongues that might have whispered kept woman spoke instead, with the pleasure people take in reforming their own opinions, of the great love match at Ashcombe. Mr. Josiah Pettifer gave the bride away, there being no father to do it, and wept into his spectacles through the whole service, and was heard to say afterward that he had bought and sold books 40 years and never once turned a profit to touch the profit of that library, which had cost a duke a fortune and bought a marriage and mended 2 lives, and was, he declared, the best stock he had ever handled and the only lot he had ever grieved to see leave his shop and rejoiced to see it just the same. Mrs. Honoria Marsh did not prosper. The story of the burned books, once the county had the whole of it, did precisely what Gabriel had foretold. It fell upon its author. The doors that had opened so grudgingly to the vulgar climbing widow closed now in earnest, and stayed closed. For there is a great deal a neighborhood will forgive an ambitious mother, but the burning of a dead man's library to spite his orphan daughter, and the attempt to blackmail a duke over his own generosity, were not among the forgivable things, and Mrs. Marsh found herself, within a 12-month, so entirely frozen out of the society she had schemed her whole life to enter that she gave up the Grange and removed to Bath, where nobody knew her and nobody, once they did, cared to. She was humbled not by any stroke of Gabriel's, he lifted no hand against her, but exactly as he had said she would be, by being left alone at last with her own hard heart and the cold company of everything she had chosen over kindness. Adelaide, freed of her mother's ambitions, married in the end a good-natured attorney of modest means, and was, by all accounts, the happier for having given up being a weapon. And the new Duchess of Ashcombe, who bore her cousin no grudge, sent her a wedding gift of books, chosen with care, that Adelaide never read but kept, and was touched by, and mentioned sometimes in later years, when she wished to imply a grander connection than her attorney's parlour otherwise suggested. As for the library, the Reverend Josiah Clare's library, 1,100 volumes, hunted back one by one across a whole year from every corner of England, it came at last, entire, to a long sunlit room at Ashcombe that Gabriel gave over to it wholly, and had fitted with shelves of honest oak, and named in a small brass plate above the door that his Duchess laughed at and would not let him take down, the Clare Library. It stood among the 10,000 volumes of the Ashcombe collection, not as a poor relation, but as its dearest treasure, the plain worn calf and shabby green bindings and pencil-marked margins of a country parson's life, kept in a duke's great house with more honor than the Aldines and the folios. And on winter evenings, the Duke and Duchess of Ashcombe sat there together among the books that had brought them to each other, and read, and argued gloriously over Dante and Lucretius and the merits of the new poets, and Rosamund would win as often as not, and Gabriel would not have had it otherwise. And in the fullness of time there came to sit among them, on a low stool by the fire, a dark-browed, gray-eyed young one who learned to read early and fiercely from the marked margins of a grandfather never known, and to whom the tale was told every winter of the morning a book was pulled from a fire and a whole life was pulled from the ashes after it, 1 volume at a time, by a foolish, generous man who had learned, almost too late, that the truest love does not rescue or arrange or spend, but only, in the end, asks and waits, humbled and hoping for the free and treasured yes.